Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. As folks start to gather, we are going to start and get this going for everyone who got here on time with us. It's so wonderful to have you all here. I'm Jessica Dudley, the Director of Chicago African Americans and Philanthropy, and so excited to be joining you all for tonight's conversation. Appreciate you all joining us in the evening to be a part of this amazing conversation. I am going to hand it over very quickly to Tiff Beatty, who is going to be doing introductions and leading our conversation, really getting us started tonight. I'll be monitoring the chat for any questions that come to our panelists, so please send them through. We'll have some time towards the end for a Q&A, so welcome those questions as we get started. Tiff, can I hand it to you?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Jessica. So honored to be here in conversation with you, Amanda and Monica. I'm gonna pass it over to y'all in just a minute to actually introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do for folks that may be new to you and your work. But I wanna start with my own introduction, a little bit about the work that I do, as well as ground us in a bit of a land acknowledgement, if that's all right. All right, appreciate it. Okay, so my name is Tiffany Beatty. I go by Tiff. I'm the Program Director of Arts, Culture, and Public Policy at the National Public Housing Museum, which is the first cultural institution in the United States dedicated to interpreting the history of public housing. And I want to talk a little bit more about the museum, and I'll get into some of that, but we really will focus on this work around Black spaces. And I think there's some intersections there. But again, we'll start with the land acknowledgement. So I want to really recognize the land on which we sit, especially in this context of talking about Black space. This is the land where this is the context, the land where we create this space, as well as the Indigenous people who are the past, present, and future caretakers of this occupied territory. We also want to acknowledge the enslaved African people who were stolen and brought to this country and built this country. This land and this space, which today we call Chicago, was here a long time before we showed up. And so we want to recognize it as the traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi people. This land sits on water, and so several other tribes have also called this area home. So we also recognize the Miami, the Ho-Chunk, the Peoria, the Menominee, the Sac, and the Fox. This land is the land that received two great Black migrations. We are a heavily immigrant city, a segregated city, a city of neighborhoods and interracial movements. And I hope that this land acknowledgement and all of those who have come before can guide us as we navigate the complexity of the need to enshrine Black spaces. So if you are not in Chicago and you want to also acknowledge the land and the Indigenous caretakers of the land where you sit, we invite you to just do that in the chat now. And if you don't know, we encourage you to do a little research. But just bringing it back to the Public Housing Museum, I also want to recognize that over the past century, more than 10 million people across the United States have called public housing home. Since the 90s, after public housing had become predominantly Black, thousands of public housing units across the US have been demolished. As public housing residents were fighting for their homes, they were simultaneously began to dream about creating a museum to preserve their heritage and their stories and their objects. And eventually they were able to partner with preservationists, cultural workers, and philanthropists, which is, again, relevant to this conversation, but to create this museum. And so, we are building a museum in the former Jane Addams homes on the Near West Side. And you may have heard our director, Lisa Yoon Lee, say this before, but we are opening soon. I promise this time. But seriously, we are, beginning construction later this year. So really excited to be at the museum. I've been at the museum since June of 2020 as an international site of conscience. We use the power of place and memory to connect the past with contemporary social justice issues and human rights. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and propel the right of all people to a place to call home. So with all of that said, I'm a cultural programmer and organizer, and sometimes a poet or performer, but I am not, I repeat, not an urban planner, an architect, or preservationist. We have those people around Chicago. And so I really just want to be a facilitator and help, contribute however I can from my perspective at the museum. But again, I will be asking some questions. And I look forward to learning more about how our work is complementary and also finding connections with folks in the audience who may have questions as well. Okay, so hopefully that was a bit about myself and sort of catches us all up. Now I want to go ahead and just pass it over to, I guess we'll start with Monica. If you could just introduce yourself, feel free to give as much detail or as little as you want, and then we'll kind of do some follow-up questions from there.
All right, thank you, Tiff, appreciate it. And again, thank you to Jessica and the organizing committee for inviting me to join y'all today in a conversation. So I'm Monica Rhodes. I am originally from Texas, a 6th generation Texan, in fact. And I have been fascinated with history since I was a child, going to my family cemetery and spending time looking at historic buildings and just reading a lot. So naturally majored in history. Fast forward, decided to get a master's in both African-American studies as well as historic preservation, and have been working at the intersection of preservation, history, place, and community for almost 15 years now. Based in Baltimore, and I've spent the majority of my career in DC working for national nonprofits in the space, like the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Park Foundation. In those positions, I created the first and largest workforce development program in the country, focused in on training the next generation of preservation trades professionals, and also reestablished one of the longest running programs dedicated to preserving Latino heritage in national parks, another one dedicated to preserving African-American heritage in national parks, and helped establish one preserving all women's heritage in national parks as well. So I am currently at Harvard University as a part of the Loeb Fellowship, and having an excellent time just kind of thinking and reflecting on the next steps on my journey. So that's me in a nutshell, and thank you for the opportunity. Back to you, Tiff.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, I'm just gonna pass it right over to you, Amanda.
That was awesome. Like, oh my God, and you did that, and you did that, and you did that. I'm Amanda Williams. I am from Chicago and currently reside in Chicago in the Bronzeville neighborhood. I trained as an architect. I'm a practicing artist now, but do a lot of work that intersects still with the built environment, public art, and think a lot about the term Black space. So I'm excited to be here in this conversation because this is, I think, a frame and a lens on the subject matter that's different than I'm typically engaging in. There's a lot of conversations, obviously, around architecture with that subject, but then also a lot of my contemporaries in visual, performing, installation, sculptural arts have been thinking about that. Also literary music spaces. I've been thinking about the idea of what Black space is. What else do I need to say before we jump in?
Yeah, I was gonna say you're actually getting into my next question, so I'm just gonna keep it here locked on you, Amanda.
Yeah. I should probably say I'm also along with Lakon Jayafis, who I went to school with. I went to school at Cornell, studied architecture. Tiff was kind enough to move over. You can see the sculptural threshold work that we've been working on with the team at the National Public Housing Museum. And I'll bring that up again when we talk because it has a direct connection to ideas about preservation. So that'll be a good reference. But yeah, go forward, jump in.
Yeah. So I mean, you were kind of getting into this conversation around what is this term Black space and who's talking about it? And so I just wanted to really ground us in this terminology of Black space. Just starting with you, Amanda, maybe, I mean, I know you think a lot about color And also, you even have a TED Talk really talking about, so we won't make you do your whole TED Talk right here, but people can go find that. But talking about, Black as, or color as a medium, but also as a way that, you're defined, and sort of pushing against that, using that and thinking about the intersections with Black color, or excuse me, Black culture. And so, yeah, I just wanted to maybe, just hear anything that you might want to touch on. I mean, I know you have many other projects too, but that was one that I thought of immediately. So, yeah.
Yeah, so I think the question of space itself has been something I've been thinking about a long time. I went to architecture school because I thought that the way that you address the things that I was seeing I grew up in Auburn Gresham, in the neighborhoods and the kind of ways that we traverse the city, was to build a thing to sit on the space where nothing was. And so my architectural thesis actually was called "There Are No Blank Sheets of Paper in the City," and I thought I had just figured it out. That was it. And it was, just this revelation for me that, these things don't come as a clean slate. And the way that at the time we didn't really have computers, we were at a moment where it was the beginning of the segue into drawing digitally and not by hand. But if you imagine a kind of May line with this blank slate, you'd always begin a project with nothing. And then you were empowered and encouraged to imagine that you were some kind of genius that was going to, from nothing, design something that would last forever, right? Like there was no thought about a life cycle of a thing and what it meant. It was the full focus was on the kind of beauty and the understanding of it. Cornell, as a tradition, really does focus on ideas of space versus building, and that's a super insider baseball maybe for this conversation, but it's the idea that we interchange those words all the time, but that space and how we occupy space, spatial sequences, spatial practices is a common term used now. So if you think about Black spatial practices, instantly you sort of know what I mean, right? But the idea that you move through a sequence of things in a certain way, depending on what you think they are or not, and they're impacted by a lot of factors. But that a building is an object that sits. That space is more expansive than that, and it also is something that people that call themselves architects shape, but other people shape it in different ways. So we privilege ourselves as the ultimate shapers because we somehow have decided that the building is the most important thing. But people from all these other disciplines understand that there's so many other factors that impact the way we experience our bodies in space. So Black space for me is a phrase that I keep coming back to because it feels very elusive. Like, what is Black space? So are we talking about spaces that are occupied predominantly by Black bodies? So is Inglewood a Black space? Because historically it was workers who were not Black. Or is Harlem a Black space? Because it was a word used for sort of New Amsterdam, right? So there's a way that these places have evolved and they've maintained themselves primarily as sites for particular groups over time that can alter. There seems to be an injustice when spaces we occupy, because we typically get removed or displaced from those spaces without our permission or not on our own terms. So there always seems to be an injustice about the shift of how physical space is programmed, built upon, erased, because we largely haven't had control over that. But if you just think about the ground as the ground, or the environment as the environment, or you think of it more holistically, then it becomes a little bit elusive what Black space is. And so then that's when I get excited about folks that are in disciplines that are thinking about it, internal space, whether that's spirituality, whether that's a more expansive worldview that is not about territory, is not about individualism, is not about ownership. So those are ways that constantly complicate what tends to be my focus, which is spaces where a lot of Black people are. So when you live somewhere like Chicago and segregation is so rampant, it's hard to understand that the entire world is not literally in like neat, discrete boxes aggregating who can be in what space, and mentally you maintain these lines that say, I don't go past Western, I don't go north of Roosevelt, I don't go south of blah, blah, blah. But for me, the spaces in Chicago that have been in the last, say, 50 years predominantly occupied by brown people are the spaces that I tend to be the most invested in, and the spaces that I've done the most work in and around. And so I'm also a child of hip hop 1.0, I like to call it. So I like this kind of constant layered meanings and things. And I've started to think about that in relationship to histories and preservation, even this idea that we can hold on to a memory, we can hold on to a thing by misusing a term or using a term that's rooted in a certain moment so that when we say it, everybody understands, or we can conjure a kind of kindred understanding based on something we say. So you'll see a lot in the things that I use as kind of both mnemonic devices, but also kind of prompts for people, is trying to really hone in on a time period, maybe a geography. So, the most popular one I use constantly is ultra sheen. So if you're from Chicago and you're a certain age and you say ultra sheen, you're like, yes. Or you're like, oh, that's interesting. Or I remember that. Or yeah, I used to work there. Or, it's a way to kind of orient you around these things that are at one point, at one moment objects, but they also talk about, again, a kind of collective space that we had. That company, along with several others that kind of came into being in my coming of age, they were full companies by the time I can have a memory of them. They employed a huge amount of the South Side, and their headquarters were on the South Side. And the Luster Company, the Pink Oil Company, which is one of the other colored theory houses, they are still in existence. And so, what does it mean to have a collective mental space that remembers that has pride in that feels like they own Ebony Jet, that feels like, Oprah's their friend, that feels like they could hang with Michael Jordan. Like there's a certain moment, right? And this is another moment. There's other historical moments. And so I think those are the threads that can tie us through a Black space that's not just physical, but also brings in all these other components. I think of late, we tend to blur the distinctions when I don't know that always helps us. I think it's important to understand the individual frames, or the benefit of ways to see it that aren't my way, is quite literal most of the time, but to really push back on myself to make sure that I'm not always kind of reverting to the idea that, this space is Black. Because I think the converse, and I want Monica to jump in, is that there's always an association with like lack or injustice that doesn't ever make it liberatory. So a lot of the more recent work I've also done has been thinking about Black space, literally outer space, or dark matter, or black holes, or dark space, so that, other scholars that have done work in writing around that, both in architecture, but also then in the sciences, like what does that do when we don't assign emotion to the things we're invested in? Like, how do we see it differently if we can remain invested in it, but not put a tint of kind of emotion around what we think it means? So I'll stop there and let Monica jump in. But those are all the Black spaces.
All the pieces, right? You just gave us the blueprint for the conversation. I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, I agree, Amanda. Like, Black spaces, everything, and, right? And it reminds me of a poem I saw on Black Girls Rock a few years back, where the poet was like, Black is a color, adjective, adverb, and noun. Like it's all these things, in one. And so when I think about Black space, I know we often say, because it's Black History Month, Black history is American history, and like yes, and water's wet, and yes, and we know. But I also think about the fact, again, just having worked across the country and around preservation construction, and seeing preservation through the lens of people that ain't never heard of historic preservation. That's kind of the field. That's where I enter the space. And so, they are, working on these buildings, doing the work, Nina Simone, John Coltrane, Martin Luther King's birth home, like all across doing these things. But there were places that they worked on, these young people, where, a part of the training is one day we will orient them to historic preservation. Like, what is it? Why are we not knocking this thing down and building a new one? So establishing a preservation ethic, right? Then we would go through and talk about, well, why is the place that you're working is significant? Like, what's a national register? Why is this place, why are we taking the time and the energy and the money to make sure that we do this right? And so there were places where the young students, and these are 18 to 30-year-olds, they would learn the history of these places and like, well, Monica, why are we preserving a place that we couldn't enter? It was built by Black hands, like so many places in the country were, but not being in it. You couldn't access them if you had so much melanin in your skin, right? And to that, I would often respond is like, yeah, it was built by Black hands, perhaps not for Black people, but it's built by Black people. And you are a part of this legacy of the preservation of this, right? This building is beyond its use. Buildings have use over time and space, and we're looking at craftsmanship. So down in New Orleans, talking to them about all the Black craftsmen and women who were down there doing the plaster work, even for places that they couldn't even eat in, right? But getting these young people excited about being able to see that their legacy is beyond the places that they were not allowed to go. And that, we just would riff on that, on and on about the importance of space beyond contemporary understanding or even historical wrongs. And so these young people were able to enter the conversation in a way that contributed to the legacy of the people that constructed those things, people who often were nameless, or in the case of a project we work on down in Beaufort, South Carolina, at Reconstruction Era National Monument, or National Historical Park now. The church down there, Brick Baptist Church, it was built by enslaved Africans, and they left their mark on it, because if you still go down there, you can put your hands in the handprint. Somebody left a handprint as they were built, building the brick and then creating the building. That church was built for a white congregation, and then when Reconstruction came, the white people left town, and the Black people who built that church took it over, and that congregation is still there. And so even though, again, it had this legacy that didn't include a use or wasn't originally built for, there was young people are still able to contribute to that and actually see the work that went into it, even though there may not be a name that we can attach to that work. And so the way that I think about Black spaces is everywhere. It's everywhere. It's everything. It's expansive. It goes from coast to coast. North to south. It's the DNA of this country, and from my estimation, there's no past, present, or future of preservation without considering and prioritizing Black space in it.
Yes, you just so I'm somebody who thinks about words and language, and you just reminded me of that. I can't take credit for this, but one of my Instagram friends has this. I'll try to remember it and put it in the chat before we're done. But that this animation about the word be, and how Black people use be as a present, future, past. Like, he be on the block, he be eating, like it just means, he's always been eating. And that's just something that's part of our culture that I love. And what you're saying, I can sort of relate to it in that way. So yeah, thank you for that, just grounding us in this idea of Black space, and getting, I think, maybe speaking from, or however you want to approach this, but thinking about your current work, or thinking about the future, like what is the role of Black people in this conversation now and looking forward. Monica, you focused a lot on the importance of preservation, and that's looking at history, but also, we are making history right now, and what is important, I guess, from both of your perspectives about Black people actively being involved in these spaces now, and if you want to speak to the future, but sometimes that can get a little big.
Yeah. No, I would say, we're central to the conversation because we've been in the conversation. And I often, joke around with my sisters, Black folks are one of the most sustainable groups of people because we reuse the grocery bags. And grocery bags get used. And then I'm thinking about like, what else do we reuse? And I'm like, okay, the Danish cookies, the tin can, my great grandmother would use that to put her needles and her thread in. And every now and again, she may switch it out and we actually get cookies, but it was rare, right? She had other uses. And then I was also thinking about the use of a Crown Royal bag. I mean, Crown Royal bag, come on. So Amanda, your point, right? About the collective space, like the collective things that we hold, like, so we are in essence a community that preserves and thinks about the reuse of things again and again. And to extrapolate that out a little bit more, thinking about congregations and Black churches, and the fact that when the collection plate is passed around, that contributes to the building fund, that is preservation. That's preservation. Like, or, fix the windows, the steeple, the tower. Like that is what we do. And so we've been about this work. And a part of my my charge has been to be able to connect this. I wouldn't even call it informal. These conversations that are happening in communities that's not necessarily connected to funding and resources and capital. So how do we bring these two worlds together so they're talking to each other? So as we're passing the collection plate around, we also have a foundation, or there's a capital campaign that's also associated with this, and it's just not coming from the community alone, but it's and, right? And so I've kind of been reflecting and thinking about how do we build these institutional infrastructures that are around these Black communities. So yes, funding does come from the Black community, but we can also use philanthropy to help cover some of those gaps that exist in the fact that maybe the building fund has been going on for 20 years and the window still ain't fixed, right?
Keep passing the plate. Keep
Right.
passing.
Around. Yeah, right. But yeah, so I think about preservation in so many different ways. Even the visitation, when people visit these historic sites and they pay an entrance fee, well, that's not only considered contributing to the stewardship of the place, but that's contributing to its preservation, whether it's the stories or actually the physical building. And so, from my estimation, again, preservation is the lifeblood of what we've been about and what we will continue to be about. And I'm very pleased to see the amount of funding that's now flowing into the preservation space, that organizations are now paying more attention to the work that has already been happening, that's been happening for decades, for centuries in communities, because a place like Harriet Tubman's church in New York wouldn't not be there, and had it not been for the AME Zion Church, who had it for over a century before the National Park Service acquired it, right? But they don't see themselves as a preservation organization, but they are. That building would not be there had it not been for that church, right? So I can go on and on about how HBCUs are in the preservation business, but don't necessarily talk about it as much. But certainly want to hear Amanda's thoughts on what you're thinking about Black communities and preservation and planning and architecture.
I think for me, it's a both and. I'm constantly thinking about it of late from like two directions at once. So one is, I feel like in some ways the ultimate preservation is to acknowledge that everything is going to go away, and then there's not a preciousness. And that doesn't mean that things don't need to be stewarded and cared for and maintained. But once we come to terms with something going away, and we think about that moment as much as we think about the birth of it or its life, then I think there's a kind of preparedness to shift how we might think about the thing. So if it's a physical thing, if it's a building, and we know it's going to go away eventually at some point, what do we do in the interim to make sure that we document it or enjoy it as a present sort of being, as a thing that we can hold with us because we have a memory of something that happened there, and again, not see it as an injustice. So I think the fact that we have such tenuous relationships to everything, it makes us nervous. I had totally forgotten that. I didn't forget about the project, but I forgot about it in this context. I did a project, I guess 11 years ago. My daughter will be 11 next week. So 11 years ago, called She Get It From Her Mama. And so it started off as a joke with a good friend of mine, April Banks, who's also an architect turned artist in the Bay Area. And we were like, we don't really know exactly how we got here. Like, some people can go back 5 years, some people can go back 5 generations, but we don't really know. And then we kind of just know there's Africa, So we took these, at the time it was relatively new, these DNA tests, right? And then we fully expected to get the results back and say Africa. And then hers said like Pakistan or something else. And she was like, what? I'm from Virginia. What? And then I said Ethiopia. So I was like, yes, I am. Yes. Give it to me. And it wasn't exactly like that. It was like, it's not how they make it look in the commercials. At least when we did it, it was like, you're haplogroup XXT and you're haplogroup TTX. Or, it was like, but the idea that we would privilege this mysterious piece of paper and not our folklore and our oral histories. And so each of us picked an oral history that we had in our families, and then we embellished it in these art objects that we made. And then I thought it was funny to like place it in the gallery in a way that made it look like it was historic. So my mother always tells this story about her grandmother dipping snuff, and she had this little buttercup snuff can. And then I asked my mother's sisters, and every single one of them had a different description of this cup. So it was the size of a Campbell soup can. It was the size of a pill box. So I could never really nail down, right? And it's like, well, I gave them all a piece of paper. Draw the house you grew up in, like wildly different, and not just from like they can't draw architectural plans, right? It was just like, well, it was 2 rooms. It's like, no, my big mama's room is in the back, and it's like, no, it was off to the side. The kitchen was in the back. Like constant arguing, but there was like an important process of both me having them draw, because I don't know where it is. If I had to find it in Alabama, I can't find the family home anymore, right? So it was like this was a way to kind of repeat, or the preservation in a strange way that wasn't about the actual saving of a physical object, right? So the power of being able to let it go and imagining other ways to hold on to the parts that are important, or to enjoy the fact that the story gets more and more embellished the farther away you get from it. Like that can be part of the process. I think that opens up a whole new realm of understanding what the word preservation might be. So my project color theory, which a lot of people have heard about and know about, there's a power of the colors themselves, because it kind of recommands the rainbow. So people are like, yeah, like your crown royal. It's like, well, it's really just purple. But it's it's like, yeah. And I was in front of one of your houses. Like, well, I don't actually own it. There's a color on the spectrum, and the Luster family did not ask me to do that. You know what I mean? It's like, but it took control or command over our associations with these things and gave us ownership of it. And so the idea of shrouding these buildings that were already set to go away was so powerful, because I can't tell you how many people, we painted a house Flaming Hot's orange, right? House was hundreds of years old, and it was this very strange mint green before we painted it. And if you ask 20 people, they'd be like, well, the house that was on that corner, like they never mentioned this strange color that the house was, because it sat vacant and was like, it's kind of visible in plain sight. The number of people that say where the orange house was, the house was orange for 2 weeks. But people they remembered it was so strong, not only because that's a saturated color, but because it was just so strange in the psyche of like this beautiful thing that sat there. And so as a ghost, or as a kind of memory, it was preserved, or these moments of our collective memory are preserved in these things that don't exist in these physical spaces anymore. And so that's powerful. So that's one way that I constantly am thinking about pushing the boundary of the idea of preservation and why we hold on to things. I'm a hoarder. So how do you let go, or like, whoever wrote the book and just like say goodbye and you were very good to me, and then you throw it away, right? The second way I think about it, though, and I think it's because I have young children who are fully engrossed in this kind of digital world, social media, and you're trying to balance wanting them to be part of their moment in world and, kind of temporal history, but you don't want them to be overwhelmed by it, right? But the idea of hashtagging is so powerful as an archive, and the idea of, being able to do what's it called, the time machine backup on your computer, like these ways that preserving things are just integral to this kind of throwaway click culture that we have. And so I'm hyper sensitive, or not worried is too strong of a word, of like, because it's so ubiquitous, like we don't print pictures anymore. So like the little photo album, even in college or after college, a little throwaway camera, we take it to Walgreens and they print your pictures. Like we don't have those. Those albums in our house stopped about 2010.
Yeah.
We don't have them anymore. And so I have a bunch of phones stacked up that's like a photo album. You know what I mean? Like when you go to the next phone and it drops, all of them don't come. And so you hold on to the phone or the SIM card or the, there's a way that the power of the cloud, all these ways that we think we're preserving things, but then we're 2 steps away from whatever the technology is to access the thing. So I'm also then, so on the one hand, I'm saying, let it go, let it be. You know? Like, on the other hand, I'm like, I don't think I have a picture of the girls when they were 3 months old. Where are the pictures when they were 3 months old? I don't have the pictures anymore.
Well, Amanda, you struck a chord when you were
Right?
talking about the time machine. I just had I lost a whole bunch of stuff messing around with time machine.
But then when you find it again, right? You lose it. I find my phone or something. You lose it, and you're like, well, it's an object. It's a material item.
Right.
Just let it go.
And then you find it, and you're like, look, this was last Thursday. You're so excited that you still have a picture from last Thursday, right? And so, what's the potential of that? I guess in the next generation of like paying attention and not throwing things away, you know, because we know that not only are those memories important because our relationships and stuff is so tenuous, but because there is an importance to the physical thing. And so it's not going to go away because I'm not the Unabomber. It's not going to go away because of technology, but I do think the ability to appreciate the more traditional terminology of preservation is important in lockstep with that. So how you do the both and I haven't figured out. I tend to just toggle between projects that try to, you know, like you said, reusing garbage bags and like, you know, so assemblages with like every picture from this, or, you know, taking stuff. I have an aunt that has this amazing collection of family artifacts and using those in paintings. And then on the other hand, you know, just wanting to be in the moment and not wanting any pictures because you just have to remember, and that's your preservation, you know, like
there's a so the US based preservation is one called preservation, and it's really focused on, you know, the built environment, what we can see, what has integrity, what has historical significance. And I can talk all day about how significance is very subjective, right? But on the other hand, in the rest of the world, right, you know, preservation is called conservation, and it leaves room for both the tangible and intangible heritage, right? They're both the same. Like, you know, yes, Aga Khan is impactful because of its history, but also because of the culture, and that becomes a part of the story as well. So whether that physical place is there or not, it's still revered and appreciated in a way that leaves space in other parts of the world that the US just doesn't have. I mean, we try to get to like cultural preservation districts a little bit, you know, arts districts a little bit, but leaving room for the thing that's no longer here. You know, we have a ways to go in the US to get to where the rest of the world is already thinking.
Tiff, can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, please, please.
So what do you think? I just thought about that when you said that. What do you think about an idea that, and this goes with history in general too, or not the idea, but the notion that there's also propaganda in some of this, or is there not enough of an effort on our parts to understand that this comes up a lot, obviously, in the monuments space, right? But there's a campaign to use ideas about cultural heritage and preserving certain things so that the significance of certain stories is maintained, and then by default then renders other stories insignificant because they are not the ones that are maintained. So if you could talk a little bit about, I'm sure you come up against it all the time, but the kind of preservation and conservation space of, well, of course we've got to save so-and-so, right? It's like that energy, that kind of.
Right. So I'll say back in, I guess this was like 2013, 2014, I was doing a project in New Orleans at a cemetery. And after I had like 700 volunteers in the cemetery working at the end of the day. And so we were, you know, eating our crawfish because, you know, every project I did, we had to have food. We got to have a barbecue, right? So I'm sitting there eating, and this older white woman walks up to me, and at that point, like, you know, New Orleans was one of the first, you know, touch points where it started, right, under that mayor. And she came up to me and was like, you know, Monica, I don't understand what's going on with these monuments. We didn't have racism in New Orleans until people started talking about these monuments. Straight face, right? And so to see that just kind of pick up and see this huge backlash, and what happened a summer ago, with people in the street like rallying around these monuments as like these anchor points, like in both ways, right? We saw people down in Charlottesville rallying around a monument. We also saw people trying to go to the Mary McLeod Bethune Monument in DC. So people are seeing these monuments as places to gather and think and converge with folks who are like-minded on whatever side they stand on. And so there's a lab, monument lab, out of UPenn, Paul Farmer, yeah. So Farber, so excuse me. So he's behind that, and they're asking these very hard questions of, well, why? And the Fast Company just did this. You know, there was not a black monument to a black person until 1974, right? Well, why was that? How did we get there? You know, what stories are being left out of the conversations? We don't uphold or valorize certain parts of our heritage. You know, in one of the Monuments Lab reports that they did, and that was funded by a Mellon Foundation, you know, they found that there were more monuments to mermaids than there were to women or Black people. You know, like these types of things are on our American landscape, and they you know, they're beyond just the physical buildings that this thing happened here, this is significant and has integrity. This was a decision made by a group of people that we want to uplift this certain part of this heritage. That, you know, these Confederate monuments across the country was a decision by the daughters of a Confederacy to push this out into the nation as, you know, this is our truth, this is who we are, and that also seeped into our textbooks and so on and so forth. And so I would say, just kind of thinking back and bringing it back to your question, is that, you know, I think we will continue to have these discussions on what space people get to occupy in the public imagination. And I think we're at the very beginnings of it. I don't think this conversation is over. And I think it will continue to be something where we see a very stark difference between the people who want a certain narrative and those monuments uplift that, versus the ones who are thinking more expansive, or even the ones who, like, you know, everything needs to come down and we don't even need to remember that the Confederacy even existed. So you have people along this spectrum, and in some ways, I think that's also one of the unfortunate and also beautiful parts of history, because it lets everybody know how much history is still with us, right? This is not our past. People are arguing and fighting out in the street on this, you know, every day. Like this is a contentious thing. And it demonstrates how important the landscape is, and memory, and who gets to control what we memorialize, and what gets remembered in this country. Amanda, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah. And a lot more, yeah. Oh, you're talking, Amanda.
I said, no, that was fantastic. I'm going to drop in the chat. Actually, I'm co-authoring a monument to Shirley Chisholm in Brooklyn.
Oh, yep. Just about to say that too.
So I promise I did not ask that question thinking of that. I had
nice
little
assist right there.
But that was that and the piece behind Tiff, I think. You know, in my head, I'm thinking of these things for other reasons, right? And so it's exciting, to have this kind of conversation, because it brings in a whole different way that I'm thinking about ideas of permanence and impermanence. And, you know, these are going to be two things that are going to have the most longevity of any of the built work, the physical work that I've made. I worked as an architect, so they're buildings that stand up. But you know what I mean? Like in terms of something that has a significance or becomes someone else's history in a really meaningful way.
Yeah, can you just, we do need to go to the Q&A for a minute, but I do want to make sure you get a chance to just tell us a little bit about, you know, you and your partner's work on this. Thresholds is called, right?
Thresholds, yeah. So Lakon JF is actually my collaborator on both of these. And it's amazing that we've never actually collaborated before. Now we have these two super beautiful, super important, super powerful works that we get to bring into realization almost at the same time. Shirley will be a little bit behind the National Public Housing Museum. But both of them are thinking about it without me thinking about it until now, and I'm going to talk about it in this way going forward, about preservation in a very powerful way. So the Public Housing Museum Threshold is actually going to take, and this was really born of a conversation that we had with Lisa Lee, going to take paint chips that were removed when they were doing some of the demolition of some of the other structures. And as Lisa tells it, it was illegal to paint your unit. That was one of these random rules that got implemented in public housing at some point. And so obviously, as you know, that's a kind of like cornerstone of our cultural expression, is to embellish and to celebrate the spaces that we exist in. And so, of course, all this is going on, and nobody's actually ever coming back to maintain the buildings or to see what's going on. So when these things start to come down, you see these layers and layers of wallpaper and paint and kind of self-created beautiful interiors. And so we've preserved some of that, and now we're going to use that to create a kind of pattern on the glazing that will be the shroud to the entrance. So you'll see the chips, and we'll work to make sure that they feel like the chips. So not only are we going to use the color to kind of make a gradient of that beautiful range of the colors that exist in, but you'll feel like that's a paint chip. You'll feel that kind of visceral nature of the paint. And then we're working with the architects and with the National Public Housing Museum to actually have some kind of encasement that will save those original chips, so that as you walk in, you actually can make a direct connection to the reality of what it was like to kind of have that experience. And then Shirley is almost the counter of that, in that we really are imagining taking and embodying her spirit of not wanting things to be about her, but really about a kind of access and an invitation for everybody to participate in civic discourse. So we're using a lot more of our kind of architectural chops to think through what it means to create a space for gathering, and also to create an anticipatory space, exactly for what you said. We're going to have moments where people will need to, when you get off the train, I'll be at the Shirley, or, it's like we need to mobilize against, the New York Teachers Union needs to, mobilize for a strike. It's like, meet us at the Shirley, so that there's a way that it becomes this beacon, or really helps that legacy that she tried to promote live on in perpetuity in a way that honors her, but also expands the conversation about what a monument should look like. So she'll be huge, and you'll be able to see her from blocks away. But as you get closer, because of the scale of the object itself, you'll have to be at the scale of other people, and it creates this kind of semicircle that mimics the congressional seating. That's that kind of arced circle. So everybody gets to see her, because folks get mad and they're like, we ain't never had a statue, and then you gonna make this, what is that? It's like, nope, there she is, there's her face, there's Shirley. But when you get here, Shirley doesn't want it to be about Shirley, so she can be looking down over us, but this is about us interacting and kind of gathering. And so I think that's powerful in a kind of way as well, the preservation of an idea, or again a way to occupy and show up in the world, as opposed to the preservation of the person, which tends to be the kind of representation of the object, of the body in that case, as the person. So I want to toss those two out there as kind of, again, a both and of preservation.
Yeah, I'll just add. So I don't have any work coming out, but I did have a good conversation.
But you're a Loeb Fellow.
Right, that's big. That's enough.
But so I had a really good conversation with a former colleague from the National Trust. She now leads the Preservation Chicago's engagement efforts. And so she was telling me about the things that are happening where folks, philanthropy, the philanthropic community can get involved, like the Muddy Waters House.
Yeah.
And the Emmett and Mamie Till Mobley historic landmark in Chicago. Also, the Bronzeville Black Metropolis National Heritage Area. That legislation was just put forward by Representative Rush again. So that those types of things are happening in the city and more. And so I'm just putting the plug in to Preservation Chicago. I can put her email in the box for those who are interested in finding ways to contribute to places like Quinn Chapel, for example. So these things are happening in communities. And while we certainly want to uplift the intangible culture that exists throughout the city, there are some historic sites that are in need of philanthropic support. And so this is, and I began to mention, community groups can do so much, and those dollars have to come in from other places to help supplement those things. So I'm happy to talk more about that. Don't want to, make a whole commercial and want to leave room for for questions, but certainly
Yep.
want to put in a plug for the work that Preservation Chicago is doing throughout the city, and offer an opportunity for people to link up with Mary Lou.
Thanks for that. I also had to do the plug for the NPHM, talked about at the beginning. We're preserving this building right here. That's not what it looks like right now, but it will with your help. So we have, it's called the Power of Place campaign, and it's all about preserving the building and bringing in, this conservation as well, thinking about the stories, the music, the people from public housing and the things that they went on to do. As well as everyday stories. And we'll also have an oral history studio. We have our oral history archive manager in the building. We're using oral history actually to collect the stories from the people about their built environment and the culture of public housing. And so we're thinking about those things together, and also, holding that contradiction of people's stories don't always tell the same truth, but holding that is also, another truth in itself, that dialogic truth that we talk about. And so, there's definitely lots of more things coming in terms of the museum, but I just want to make sure that if there are other folks, or Amanda, if you want to say anything, plug any other organizations or other things, and also folks, keep dropping stuff in the chat along with your final questions.
Yeah, I want to lift up two things really quickly before people chime in with questions or comments. One is Tiff, you talked with Tanika Johnson, I think recently, the podcast you guys have, and she's the artist as instigator, which I love. Artist as instigator at the National Public Housing Museum. She has an amazing project called Inequity for Sale, where she's taken data that recorded every house that was stolen through contract buying in Chicago in the 40s and 50s on the south and west side. There are 663 of them that she is creating these markers for. Well, she's only created 15 so far, but I'm harassing her. She's gonna block my call soon. That she has to do all 663. So they're the beautiful stanchions that she's designed with J&J Creative, which is a Black graphic design firm out of Inglewood, to mark these things. So she talked about, we were on a Zoom this morning, and she talked about this process of how landmarks or kind of placards are made, and that either the process was a little bit cumbersome or too slow for her, so she made her own landmark. And so she's going around to these parcels and placing them if they're not occupied right now, or having engagement conversations if the houses are occupied or owned by other folks, to mark this history. But you can imagine the power of seeing the landscape literally of how things have been stolen from us, and that we don't even have an ability to preserve things that happen. So I think that's, again, a really interesting idea about something created anew to talk about a kind of preservation, even if a physical thing is not there anymore. That's super powerful. And then the other item I just dropped in the chat was, I kind of feel like sometimes a rare win. We watch things go away, and I cry. We watch things go away, and you're like, but we could have, but why didn't? And then it's gone, and then you kind of forget 5 or 6 years later, right? The Johnson Test Kitchen that was part of the Ebony Jet building, and it was so revolutionary to have a Black firm hire a Black architect to make one of the first Black kind of downtown from scratch high rises on Michigan Avenue. And when it was sold and then was being transferred to a developer that was turning it into condos, in what I'm not in the development world, but I've rarely seen, the developer understood, without really knowing exactly what it was, that this was important. And so they worked with Landmarks Illinois, shout out to Landmarks Illinois, sold it to them for $1, and they were able to steward it and preserve it. And then they convened a panel of us. There were probably about 15 or 20 of us that really worked very quickly to figure out where this kitchen should live as a history. So the idea that they could deconstruct it and not demolish it, and then preserve it, and then really work with stewards from across kind of industry to figure out where it needed to land. And so we sent out a call for proposals as a kind of first step. And I think just this week, if not next week, it's going to open as part of an exhibition that's being helmed by, I'm going to get the names right here, Jessica Harris, and it's for a museum of food and drink. And so they're going to have an exhibition that'll be on display through June in New York. But it's really important to kind of understand that it can be part of these conversations and tell these stories, but that it as an object and a historical thing can live on. And for those of you that don't know, Ebony, obviously most of us know what Ebony Jet is, but the building itself had a floor that had a test kitchen, and they would do this thing called date with a dish. And so Muhammad Ali or Janet Jackson or Aretha Franklin would come and make a meal, and they'd do an article about it and they'd talk about it. And so they're these kind of amazing stewards and I guess storytellers, if you think of it now, even if they didn't know that was going to be their role in present day. Charlotte Draper was an editor. There was I got to remember all these names because I'm going to be talking about this over and over again. I'm so excited that it went through, that it happened. Charlotte Lyons. So there's so many of these folks that are still with us that can talk about the preservation of that thing. And if you've never seen some of those interiors, please Google it or click on that link, because they were wild. That floor was actually, I mean, that test kitchen was an experiment with John and Eunice Johnson's skin color that was then mixed into a swirl to create the pattern. And this is a moment in interior design where they'd make the floor, the wall, the ceiling, all the same thing. So the room is just like this psychedelic range of browns and oranges and yellows. And then it's like the first pull drawer microwave. And, it's just like, it was out of control for, the 60s. This was the creme de la creme. And so to know that the physical thing, going back to what you were saying, that is important at some point, that the physical object, in addition to the ability to tell these stories and these memories, and obviously we have an expansive photographic oeuvre of Ebony Jet, right? But to have all of that be preserved, like, it's important. People feel pride. They feel ownership. They feel like they existed, that they mattered, And so I just want to lift up that feels like one of the few instances where a developer pauses. They still built their lovely market rate housing, but it was like, this looks to be very important. We should we should do something with this. And so I'm just grateful that story has a really strong continuing legacy.
And I think any opportunity to preserve beyond the pain, that's a part of the narrative of life.
Yes.
Like I'm all for it. So I'm looking forward to reading that article. That's an amazing project.
Yeah. So it opens, I think, this week. So those of you that are not local, and it goes through June, or if you get to New York, that'd be beautiful to see.
Yeah, talk about Black space, right?
Yeah, right. Swirling skin tones. I mean, just
right. That's too perfect. Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned Tanika's project too, because one of the things that we worked on the language, and one of the things that the sign says at the very bottom, it says that these crimes were never brought to justice. Reparations are due. So just bringing it also just full circle to this conversation about philanthropy, that it is, it's nice to think about tearing things down, but also you can still be building things. We can still be contributing to Black space and to Black culture today. And that's so necessary, not only just for the resources and to have the things, but also for the narrative, for the, so our heritage and our stories to be passed on in all of these ways, and to shift the narrative in the public imagination too. I think that's something that you brought up, Monica Rhodes. Just, philanthropy can say a lot with money, that this thing is important, this thing happened, and draw attention of folks that, wouldn't necessarily even consider some of these conversations unless there's some money behind it. And so that's also part of the story as well. So I know you all in this room are already, I'm preaching to the choir at this point, but I think it's also just important to keep this conversation going and pushing it outside of our circles where we all agree. So I want to plug one more thing, which is the Just Action Racial Equity Collaborative. And I'll type that in the this is Chicago specific. So Monica, but feel free to check it out. You have Chicago friends, justaction.co. I was a part of this collaborative as a Chicago United for Equity Fellow, which is an organization in the city that does professional development and fellowship work for racial equity leaders, really connecting folks across the city to do cross-sector work. And so we built this initiative to really give folks inside organizations and outside organizations a toolkit that they can use to hold organizations accountable who say that they care about equity. So there's a sort of a checklist of like, do you do this? Do you do this? Do you do this? And based on their answers to those questions, there'll be recommended resources to, just there's lots of folks doing this work, but trying to create more alignment across different sectors, across different communities. And, we're stronger together. We can do more together. And so that's really what it's about at the end of the day. So yeah, I'm, just so blessed to be able to hold this space and to talk to y'all. And yeah, I think thank you everyone for being in the room, in the virtual room and in the chat. I don't know if these were people who were working for CAAIP or they were just really generous audience members, but there were so many links and like just information. So I really appreciate that, everyone's involvement and participation. Thank you. I think I can just go ahead and close us out here at 6:02 if y'all are good. And any final words?
No, this was fantastic. It's always good when it's nourishing, when it gives you something and you're giving something. So this was really great to be in fellowship with you all. This was fantastic.
Good.
I agree. Wonderful. I'm looking forward to hopefully meeting people in person when I get to Chicago.
Yes.
One day,
Congratulations
yes.
again. I'm excited to see what you do with your time at Loeb and what it produces afterwards. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
You're welcome.
Yep. Take your time. Enjoy.
Yes. Absorb. Yes.
Take care,
All
y'all.
right. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
All right.
Bye-bye.